Okay. All right. So Kristen Powers is the executive director of Benevolence Farm, which is why we're all here. We're super excited. Kristen worked previously, she worked at the Southern Coalition for Social Justice for as their advocacy coordinator. And tell me if I say this wrong, Kristen, but she lives in Sax. Can you say that?
Sax-Paha.
Which is a rural community in North Carolina. And to kick us off, she would like me to share a video with you, which I will do right now. And then, can you hear it?
You know, a lot of products are created and sold to make money for large companies, but then there are others with a very different goal, small operations that can truly change lives in a big way. Today, we're highlighting one that features feel-good products that are made in North Carolina. You might be surprised at what flourishes and thrives at a quiet place known as Benevolence Farm. They're getting a lot of attention for their healing salve, but these plants coming out of the ground will end up in all kinds of products.
Soap, deodorant, lip balm, muscle rub, and that healing salve. And then depending on the seasonality too, the women may make certain scented candles. We have a bug spray right now, and due to COVID, we've also started making hand sanitizers.
All natural products, which are becoming more popular every day.
If you're someone who breaks out easily or has an allergy, this is definitely something that's really great. And then we also, for those who are more sustainability minded, we do try to reduce our plastic use in packaging. So you'll find most of our things in tins and glass and other recyclable materials.
But Benevolence Farm has a larger mission, providing jobs and a living wage for the women who work here. Women who've been released from prison and are looking for a way to start their life again.
All of that feeds into a more stabilized path for reentry once they transition into a more community-based independent living situation.
The farm provides a stable, safe environment for 6 women at a time. So far, 20 have come through the program, creating products that help others feel good. Everyone and everything has a purpose. Even the chickens that provide eggs for breakfast every day.
Chickens are also very therapeutic. I know a lot of people have backyard chickens for that reason, so the women can care for them, watch them, some chicken TV if they want, and then also learn how to care for them as well. So if someday they want chickens, they already got a head start.
Whether it's chamomile, lavender, or lemon balm, growing herbs and ingredients takes time. But the results are worth it.
Like, they feel so proud that they've made a product that people feel good about. And so then I feel proud for them.
The motto around here, where second chances grow naturally.
We've all done something wrong at some point or another. I wouldn't want to be called by my worst mistake for the rest of my life, and we offer that same grace and extension to people we work with as well.
Benevolence Farm, a place where growth happens every day in many different ways. If you want to find out more about their line of personal care products, check out benevolencefarm.org. That healing salve we talked about there, it's getting a lot of attention, been nominated for several awards. But again, their website, benevolencefarm.org.
All right. So now I will share the slides, and I'll make sure to pin Kristen, and we will get this going.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Hello, everyone. I'm Kristen. I use she, aya pronouns. I'm now the executive director of Benevolence Farm. Tonight, I come from a hotel room in Dallas because of some layover problems. But as we learned, I come from Sax-Paha, North Carolina, central rural community in the South. So today I'm really excited to talk to you more about our model, excited to have our founder here, who's also featured in this photo with her shirt on. And we'll kind of talk more about what we do, why we do it, and why we decided to put together the folks we did for tonight. So if we can go to our next slide. So we're going to go over a few things. So first of all, again, I'm going to do a general overview of Benevolence Farm, as well as talking about people first language as a guide for how we're going to have this conversation, as well as talking about the different folks and communities that we serve, and then ultimately why at Benevolence Farm we seek to build a world that does not need prisons anymore. Next slide. So as you may have seen in the opening video, that was a video that was done last year during COVID. Our healing staff, which you can see here, is part of the employment program. We have several components at Benevolence. So we are a 13-acre farm in Graham, North Carolina, which is, again, central Piedmont region of North Carolina. We support women who are directly leaving prisons throughout the state of North Carolina. And this year actually will be accepting our first federal or person from a federal prison. So we're supporting people of all different experiences with a shared trauma of incarceration. So they can come and live at the farm for up to 2 years. And then they take part in this employment program as well that pays a living wage for our community. That is both a literal farm and also a body care product. And everything that is grown within the farm, or I should say every body care product is infused with something grown on the farm. So the chamomile you see here and lavender were grown on the farm and then infused into the oils that are used as the body care products. Next slide. So this is an image of the farm, so you can get an idea of what it looks like. On the left, you'll see the brick house where up to 6 women at a time can live. There are 3 bedrooms, so everyone at capacity does have a roommate, but you can see there's the front porch there. There's a kitchen, 2 common spaces, 2 bathrooms, and the women have full access to the entire property during all times. So like we said, there's 13 acres. It does extend back into the forest with a trail. That barn you see in the background that was built in 2014 by a group of NC State architecture students and community members. And then the picture here is actually what it looks like now has changed quite a bit, but you still get the same vibe of kind of the peacefulness, the access to open sky, and the benefits of nature that come with being at Benevolence. Next slide. So these are kind of our 4 focus areas. I mentioned housing as well as the employment already. But we also know, based on different research, that women in particular do benefit greatly from wraparound services. So when you think of different direct service providers, you might think, someone might help triage something and say, okay, now I need you to go to the doctors on your own, or go to this appointment on your own, or go get your ID, or you're eligible for this, but you need to set it up. And we find that can be a major barrier, particularly for people who, because the way prisons are structured, are released with really nothing to their name. So we're really intensive about our wraparound services, which is why we have a small caseload at any one point in time, because we are connecting people to their doctor's appointments, literally driving people. Right before this call, I checked the status of a birth certificate request for someone who is still waiting 3 months later for her birth certificate after release. She can't get her ID. Her bank account is about to be ended because she can't get an ID. Like, there's just all these major barriers that people face that we can go into in more detail. But that also leads us to the advocacy piece, because we know with wraparound services, with direct services, we see the same problems all the time, and we're constantly hitting our head against that same wall. We know that's not a recipe for success. So we also engage in advocacy that attempts to center the people who are directly affected. Folks have heard the phrase "nothing about us without us," and we fight for system change because we're tired of hitting our heads against that same wall. And so we work both with the individual residents to do so, especially if a problem they encounter brings up an issue like fines and fees, for example, or we will partner with statewide organizations as well. Next slide. So this is a famous quote by Brian Stevenson, who's the founder of the Equal Justice Initiative in Alabama. "Each of us is more than the worst thing we have ever done." You may have heard it also as like, we are more than the worst or the sum of our worst mistakes. Usually when I'm doing training with direct service providers about how to work with incarcerated or formerly incarcerated people, we do an exercise where I ask people, without sharing, to think of the worst thing that they have ever done and to think of the title that comes with it. And then that title following them as their first introduction everywhere they go. So if you were cheated on a test, everywhere you go, that's Kristen the cheater, or the ex-cheater. And so forever, for the rest of your life, that's what you're called. So we try to counter that narrative by using people first language, which we'll also go to in the next slide. And the reason we're bringing this up today too is because we know we'll have some Q&A and some discussion. And I know Jasmine and Dreama can go into this more, but we are super serious about people first language at Benevolence, and we understand people are in learning mode all the time. So if you slip up and use one word or the other, that's a chance just for you to learn and correct yourself. But the reason we do this again is because we don't want to center the mistake that someone made in the past. So we always say people in whatever we're saying. So people with criminal records, people with felony convictions, incarcerated people, people on the registry, people experiencing substance use disorder. And some people might think, well, that's really hard. That's inconvenient. That's a lot of words. But, we have seen firsthand the reaction people have where they get out of prison, they're trying to start off their second chance. And then we had a direct service provider, for example, not know she was off mute and said, well, that's really impressive for a felon, with the person she was interviewing. And that person who was part of our program was really hurt by that, and was really doubting herself, because she's like, well, maybe I'll just be a felon to everyone for the rest of my life. So we also see this type of language very commonly in discussions around mental health, around substance use, basically anything that has this negative stigma around it. We try to, again, center the person. And I know that with mental health, there's some discussion too about people straying away from people first language. But as far my philosophy with how we talk about incarceration is, if you have not been directly affected by it, you should use people first language. And if you hear someone who has been incarcerated say that they are, for example, a felon, that is their prerogative. They've experienced that. So if you're someone who's not experienced incarceration, I highly recommend trying to learn how to use people first language. We'll go to the next slide. Awesome. So again, a little bit about who we serve, which I think will lead really nicely into what Jasmine and Dreama are talking about. So, we work with anyone who identifies as a woman, but that is inclusive of people of all walks of life. So we haven't had this happen yet, but if someone applied who is a transgender woman, we'd be open as long as we had space and the capacity to do so, to have them. We have, I think last year when we did a tally, over 50% of our residents identified as genderqueer or gender non-binary. So we do have people who, we surprisingly have very high levels of LGBTQ communities in our population. I don't know if that's because of overlapping disenfranchisement of identities, but even our staff, currently all our staff is LGBTQ plus. So I think there's something to be said about that. We also know that about 2/3 of people who are incarcerated have experienced some sort of substance use history, whether in the form of an addiction or a family history. So the majority of people we work with have a substance use history as well. Some are in different forms or different stages of their recovery. So we do connect them to medical assisted treatment, to different NA meetings. If they want to do Al-Anon or any type of support structure for their substance use recovery, we do so, acknowledging too that recovery is a 5-year minimum process based on medical research. So we know that this is an intersecting identity that we will always be supporting. And then also people with mental health diagnoses is another huge thing. So people are majorly affected by that. One of our residents is very strongly passionate about feeling that she would not have been incarcerated. The thing that she had done to get her incarcerated would not have happened if she had been taken seriously about her mental health diagnosis. She was not giving support. She was not believed. And so that was some of the challenges we see. And I know in the juvenile system in North Carolina, for example, of the 200 people that, I think this was in 2017 when we were doing Raise the Age, of the 200 people, young people incarcerated in youth development centers or youth prisons, 198 had at least one mental health diagnosis, and or 199 had one, and 198 had two mental health diagnoses or more. So this is another major issue that we see. And then finally, we have the people in rural communities. So we tend to see here in North Carolina, and I'm sure people across the country see something similar, is this underinvestment and lack of resources for people reentering. We serve as a statewide resource, so I get calls from people, family members all over the state, and I always, when I ask, where are you from, I like pray that they're from an urban area, because at least I know where to send them to, what resources there are, with the exception of maybe 3 counties in the east that have a really good support network. There's just a real intense lack of support in rural communities. And so part of our goal at Benevolence is to fill in that gap, especially for women who are super marginalized too by things like the sex offender registry, or who are in the survived and punished category, which is women who have often escaped domestic violence and have been punished for it in myriad of ways. Next slide. So yeah, this is Benevolence. This is a sketch that our one of our volunteers did for us, but this is something that we are really passionate about, is building this community, this world that is without prisons. And so we the criminal punishment system is broad and reaching in a lot of different areas, which is why we partner with groups like Vera, like Down Home, different organizations across the state and country, where we can attack the different points of that women especially interact with, especially women in rural communities, where they are struggling to get the services and support and community that they need. And so that is Benevolence Farm. So I will pass it back to Juliana.
Thank you so much. That was fantastic. All right, so I am going to go ahead and add a pin here for the, let's see, just looking for Dreama. Here she is. Okay, adding a pin for Dreama. So now I'm going to introduce Dreama Caldwell. She is the executive co-director for Down Home, North Carolina, and she's a member of the Alamance Racial Equity Alliance. And Dreama, I will let you take it away.
Hi, you all. Thank you to Kristen and Juliana for opportunity to be a part of this roundtable. I want to start a little bit of the roundtable of sharing my own personal experience, because it leads so much into why I do this work and how I got to Down Home. And so a little bit of my own story. In 2015, I was the executive director of a child care center, and through a supervision error, a child was left behind on a bus. And so that resulted in criminal charges for the employee, for myself as the administrator, and for the owner of the daycare center. We were charged with felony child abuse, and we were facing 39 months in prison. And throughout the process, I began to see some things that I didn't even realize within this system. The first thing that I began to realize was that cash bail was a real problem. It was a real issue. And so what happened was a warrant was issued. I went down and turned myself into the warrant because my son had just graduated from high school and turned 18. I didn't want the police to come to my house to pick me up. And so I went and turned myself in. And with the arresting officer looking at my record and thinking, oh, you'll probably get about $4,000 bail, except for when I got to jail, the magistrate gave me a $40,000 bail. And so that drastically changed things for me and my family, who were prepared for a $4,000 bail. And so my sister actually knew someone who was a bail bondsman, and he was able to go ahead and come and get us, but we still needed to come and get me. And so she actually took money out of her 401k to do that. And so that happened. And after getting on the phone and talking with co-defendants and former co-workers who were arrested in another county just down the road, they were allowed to sign themselves out on an unsecured bond. And so that's when I realized something was different. because here we are with the same charges, and the only thing different is from county to county. And so I went through that process of things, and I remember meeting my attorney, and the first thing she said is, innocent people take plea deals all the time. It was the first thing that we talked about, and I was adamant that no, that wasn't what I was going to do. About 18 months later is exactly what I did. And it was to avoid being charged with a felony. And so I took that. And because of structured sentencing laws, you know, I had prior things that were on my record from 97. And here it is in 2015. It still required me to get an active sentence. And so because of that, I did get a very low active sentence of 3 days, but it was 3 days that gave me an eye-opening experience. I actually served my sentence during Christmas, the week of Christmas. And one sound that I'll never get out of my head is the sound of sleeping on the floor because they were overcrowded and hearing those women cry at night. That is something that I will never forget. And that, and then also hearing the stories of people who needed $75 or $150 to go home to their kids. They needed so little money and they didn't have it. And so after going through all of that and getting out, and I began to like figure out like this is a problem, trying to find people that were fighting the problem. And so just through all of the searches and the way Facebook works, an ad for Down Home came up. And so I was able to connect with an organizer and have a one-on-one at Down Home. And coming to Down Home, it was a space where I also brought the story and this lived experience. And there were other people there, and we began to talk about issues like criminalization of the poor, and realized that that's exactly what was happening. People weren't remaining in jail because of safety issues. People weren't remaining in jail, you know, because of guilt or innocence. These people haven't even been charged. They were there because they were poor and couldn't afford bail. And so for me, that began a story for, you know, begin looking into doing the work. Sitting in Down Home with people just wanting to fix the problems. We knew that it was a long range goal before the legislators or before even in our county before change happened. And we wanted to create change for our neighbors. And so we were, through conversations, birthed the Alamance County Bail Fund. And so through that process, we realized that the community didn't even understand that there was actually a problem. And so we went out and we began to educate people about the problem of bail and working on bail. And then we birthed this bail fund and we were able to get people out. And currently we get people out on low-level bonds because bail bondsmen don't really accept people for low-level bonds. And so we're able to just see, I know we've talked a lot about prisons, but like reentry also happens and is an issue for people coming out of the jail system as well. And so we've bailed out people for as little as $350. We've bailed out a young man who was in jail for underage drinking at 18. And so we see that this is beginning to create issues for people where they're losing their jobs and then maybe possibly their home because they're staying in jail. And then we know that race is an issue. In rural areas, race is always like minorities, Blacks and Latinx people usually are not the larger part of the population in minority areas, but they're the larger populations in the jails. And so we see that. And then we also see this thing that's happening where there's an increase of women that are going into the system for various different reasons. And so, you know, at Down Home, we've been able to find various ways. We have chapters all across the county, all across the state, and we found, you know, different ways to work on this. We know that rural areas are scouted out for new jails, new prisons, for various reasons. So out in our Western region, they're actually currently fighting, their campaign is No New Jail, and they're fighting an expansion in Haywood County of the jail and trying to prove that, you know, with the same money that they're looking to expand a jail, we could provide services and just keep people out of jail. And so, you know, that's one of the campaigns that they have here. And Alamance County does have the bail fund and stop criminalizing the poor. And they're having conversations about, you know, why we don't have a public defender office. And they're the bail fund is continuing to bail out people, which has been really big at this time this summer, where we have a Black Lives Matter and we have protests and in an area where there's over militarized police. And so there's an increase in the arrests. Also, we have issues with SROs, which is like the gateway to school to prison pipeline for so many young people who get entangled in very early. Something like a school fight could result in charges for them that could carry on for them and create problems for them. When we talk about criminalization of the poor, we also have to talk about things like fines and fees. Very, very little people understand that when someone goes into just a jail, they have jail fees for the night that they spent there. And then there's fees to use the phone. There's $10 fees to see the doctor. There are fees to get a Tylenol for pain. And so if you are in jail and you can't afford a $300 bond, you likely can't afford to see the doctor either. You can't afford to call your family or purchase anything from the canteen. So it really affects people that are poor and working class people. And those are the very people that struggle a lot of times with making their ends meet. So having their jobs are important. And so, you know, being charged with something doesn't mean they're guilty or not, or innocent. That's not what that system is for. That is what the court system is for. But if you're there for more than a couple of days and you lose your job, you know, you also could lose your home, and it's just a spiral down of things that have happened. That I have covered most of everything that I'd like to cover. But really, I think the main thing that we have to think about is that we have to find ways to combat just criminalizing people because they're poor. If we ask them, if you can't afford an attorney, then we'll help them provide an attorney for you. What happens if they can't afford the bail? What happens? And so these are questions that we have to ask. What happens if you can't pay the probation fee? We can't just keep locking up people and spending resources and simply because they can't pay fees. And so just something to think about. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Drina. That was very insightful. I certainly learned a lot that I didn't know. So I'm going to drop the link to your organization in the chat there, so everyone can kind of take a look afterward if they'd like. And again, thank you so much for sharing your story and the work that you're doing. I'm going to go ahead and introduce Jasmine now. And after Jasmine, we'll take a quick 5-minute break, let everyone get something to drink, use the bathroom if you need it, and then we will get into some Q&A. All right, so Jasmine, this is a bit longer than the other two.
You don't have to read the whole bio. It's okay.
I won't read the whole thing, but it's impressive. She works for the Vera Institute of Justice, is the project director of In Our Backyards, which I'll let her tell you about. She previously served as the deputy director of the Coalition for Public Safety and as Amnesty International USA's senior campaigner. And there's a lot more that goes along with it, but you should definitely check out in the Ticket Elf link, everything that goes along with that. So Jasmine, take it away.
Thank you so much, Juliana. I will say the experience of having your whole bio read is like one of the more cringeworthy, I think, experiences that people can have. First, I want to say, I'm so humbled in my capacity of Vera to be able to do this work in partnership with people like Kristen and Dreama. We see our work truly as resourcing movement, and they are leading movements. And I'm really grateful to you, Juliana, and to Radically Rural for creating this space for us to talk about the intersection of all of this work. And to, of course, support Benevolence Farm. Kristen and I bought some healing salve when the video was playing. It was very effective marketing. Actually, I do it every time I think of you. I pull up the site and then I'm trying to do 7 things at once. So I actually followed through this time. So I'm going to spend some time just putting, the sort of focus of Kristen and Dreama and the work that they talked about that's very rooted in a national context. And, when we talk about incarceration in rural America in this country, so often what it evokes is this history of citing state and federal prisons in rural communities, often in the wake of, organized economic abandonment, whether that was by public or private industry, or in some parts of Appalachia, for example, the decline of extractive industries and literally just putting prisons over the top of strip mines. And that is a historically accurate picture, but it is also at this point fairly incomplete. So the project that I lead at Vera in our backyards was really born out of the recognition that over the past several decades, as big cities have reduced the use of both jail and prison, so have sent fewer people for less time, really incarceration has continued to rise in smaller cities and in rural communities. And so what we see, right, is that there's this sort of incredible urban to rural divide in the trajectory of incarceration. So that today, 3 out of 5 people just who are in jail in this country are outside of major urban areas. They're in smaller cities and rural counties. And so, writ large, the continued catastrophic rise of incarceration in small places is eroding, is undermining the supposed national progress that we're making toward ending mass incarceration and dismantling the system. Kristen set us up really nicely in thinking about language and just defining some terms, and I'm going to do the same on a much simpler level. When we talk about the system, right, often we use the words prisons and jails interchangeably, and many of you probably know the difference, but just in case you don't, right, we really think of jails as the front door of the system. So for the most part, prison, state and federal, are places that people go, are sent once they've been sentenced. They're usually spending a longer time there. There are more people on any given day in a state or federal prison. They're run by wardens. They're funded through federal tax dollars or through state dollars. Jails are really the local atomized part of the system. And the name in our backyards, right, comes from this idea and the reality that nearly every community in this country has a local jail. And most of the people who are in jail on any given day, as Dreama, highlighted, are unconvicted. The vast majority are just too poor to make money bail, or they're locked up on probation violations, or they're locked up because they can't pay their child support, or they can't pay court fines and fees. And then other folks who are in local jails, include people who are serving shorter sentences, and sometimes immigrants, asylum seekers, people who are being locked up so that counties can try to generate revenue. So when we try to pull apart, right, what are the underlying drivers of this continued rise of incarceration in rural America, what we see overwhelmingly is that it is the result of criminalization, as Dreama talked about. It's criminalization of poverty, it's criminalization of behavioral health needs, of housing insecurity, of substance use disorder, and really positioning jails in so many places as the first line response when there has been no other meaningful investment and other infrastructure. And I just want to say, another sort of piece to put a finer point on money bail and connect it to the conversation that Kristen was really having about sentences and reentry. We see that those front end decisions ripple through the entire system. When a person can't afford their bail, when they sit in jail because they're too poor to pay until the disposition of their case, until they go to trial or take a plea deal, more likely, and are sentenced and convicted, right? people are more likely to serve time. They're more likely to take that plea. And so they're more likely to get a longer sentence. And then if they take a plea to a felony, as people often do, particularly when, you can't go home and see your kids and we're going to bring you to trial and give you 100 years, 90 years, really severe sentence, the consequences, what we would call the collateral consequences of that felony conviction, can follow them for the rest of their lives. And having a felony on your record, unless you can get it expunged, can make it harder to access housing, to access higher education, we hear horror stories, I think, in this work all the time of parents who can't go on school field trips with their children because of decades-old felony convictions. And so this sort of almost capricious way that criminal justice system actors treat bail on the front end of the system can ripple through into lives, into communities. I want to say, bringing it back to the focus that Benevolence has specifically on women, that when we look at the rise of incarceration in rural America, this is very explicitly an issue of gender justice. So historically, right, more men have been incarcerated in both prisons and jails than women. But currently, or over the past several decades, men's incarceration has been growing about half the rate of women's. And since 1970, the number of women in jail specifically has increased more than 1,200%, just a staggering more than a 14-fold increase in the number of women who are in jail. And like men in jail, women are disproportionately criminalized because they are Black, because they are Indigenous, because they are brown, because they are poor. The people in our nation's jails are overwhelmingly low income. And while, policing, jails, prisons are often held up as part of this public safety system, the realities and the experiences of people in jails, prisons, and even immigration detention centers, right, really illuminates the gap between the supposed aim of the system and the way that it is actually enacted onto people. The majority of women who are in jail are mothers, usually to children under the age of 18. They're overwhelmingly primary caregivers. They are disproportionately the survivors of violence, of harm, and disproportionately struggle with mental health needs, with substance use disorder. And so, what that illuminates, right, is the way in which these systems that are meant to, sorry, my neighbor is ringing my bell, but meant to deliver safety, actually deepen harm. They actually, create insecurity, and often, as we saw with COVID, right, can lead to premature death. So in this bigger context, I think it's important to say that the work of Benevolence Farm, the work of the Alamance Community Bail Fund, is really an example of community-led efforts to push back against these systems that have, in the name of supposed safety, created harm and violence, and say, what does it look like to actually take care of people? What does it look like to actually challenge these systems and say, this is what real community safety looks like, and this is how we can deliver it to one another. And I also want to put, I think an even finer point on what Dreama said about fines and fees, and just connect it again to the challenges that women who have been justice involved and women more broadly face. Historically, in this country, our criminal legal system has targeted men and Black men in particular, and we do see the increasing criminalization of women. But even before and concurrently with the rise of women's incarceration, we also see this incredible burden that women sort of carry in responding to the criminal legal system and to incarceration. The vast majority of people, of family members who pay for things like legal financial obligations, court fees, bail deposit fees, are women. They are the women who are loved ones, sisters, mothers of people who are incarcerated, men and women who are incarcerated, right? And similarly, the people who pay for commissary, who pay for phones to try to stay in touch, to try to keep their family members alive and nourished in these terrible institutions, are also women. And the way that one organization, SE Justice, which organizes out of California, has described this experience of a system disproportionately impacting people along gender and gender identity lines is one of political isolation, that the criminal justice system deepens the political isolation of women and deepens their marginalization. So I'll wrap up by saying, you know, when we put reentry, Benevolence Farm, and the work that Dreama does with Down Home, including with the bail fund, but also more expansively into this larger context, I think that it really illuminates how much thinking about things like reentry, thinking about challenging the money bail system, is tied to this larger reimagination of all of the systems around it. So why are people being arrested? Why are they being booked into jail? Why are money bail systems still in place? Why are sentences the first response when people have challenges in their lives, as opposed to alternatives to incarceration, as opposed to opportunities to reunify with families and keep them safe and whole? And so as we think about, you know, the models like Benevolence Farm, the models like Down Home, I think it's important to say we're always sort of knitting those things together to try to create the world that Kristen led us to at the very beginning, the world without prison, so that we can create a world that's really centered on community and on care.
Thank you so much, Jasmine. Fantastic. I have already so many questions myself. I hope others have questions too. I'm going to drop your In Our Backyards project in the chat there. And before we take a quick break, I'm also going to put in the chat 2 links for Benevolence Farm. One is a page where it describes some ways that we can support what they're doing, and then one for their body care products site as well, which I'm planning on ordering some myself and very excited about it. So there's 2 links there back to back. And so let's give everyone, let's see, we'll come back at like 7:53, around that. So get yourself something to drink, use the restroom, and not that I'm telling you what to do, whatever you need to do is fine. And then we'll see you back in 5 minutes. All right, so we're going to go ahead and just jump right in with questions. I will kick us off, and then anyone can either drop it in the chat or, you know, it's a pretty small group, so you can say it out loud. One question that I have is kind of a big one, but you know, a lot of us that have been on this, and especially, you know, there's potential for hundreds of people to see this in the future with our recording, because we do have such a diverse group that comes through the Radically Rural programming. So for those of us who are not directly involved in this work, but we are involved in kind of parallel worlds, what can we do? What can we do to help? And how can we bring some of these ideas into our own organizations, into our everyday lives? It's a big question, but I want to know. You know? So when I'm working with, you know, the state of New Hampshire on things, when I'm working with other organizations that have a rural bent, what can we do?
Yeah, I can try to start off. This is Kristen. So I think asking ourselves a question when we're doing policy or business or cultural programming, asking ourselves, who does this leave behind? Because, you know, I think when it's thinking about housing, employment, even certain cultural events, you know, like Jasmine mentioned, those thousands of collateral consequences might actually be barring a significant portion of the population from taking place. So if you're a business owner, you know, you can ask yourself, does my employment or my hiring practices include people who may have this conviction? How much does that actually matter to the job? If I'm renting or selling a home, how much are my current policies restricting people with records? And then I think also, you know, just overall challenging yourself with, growing up with certain terms or ideas of who people are based on their past, or based on their conviction history, can really open people's eyes. I use the sex offender registry as a big one. If you're a podcast fan, In the Dark kind of does this investigative dive into where the intensity of the sex offender registries come from, and how they really have not stayed on course as to how they're supposedly supposed to keep our children safe. But at Benevolence, because we are rural, we can actually serve a lot of people who are on the registry. But that you can get on the registry for having sex in public or urinating in public, all the way up to the things that people probably think of when they think of the registry. But in terms of thinking, that is one area I often challenge people to think of, is like, when you hear certain convictions, when you hear certain crimes, like, what do you actually know about that? When a lot of people talk about larceny, like, did they convict, that they may have stole something, but did they steal something because it was either that or their children didn't have dinner that night? Or, is it what we call crime of survival, or, desperate times. And many of us may have been privileged enough to never be in that situation. But if, it came to you having to take care of the people you love, you might want to break a few rules for that. And so, I think there's this, again, challenging one another to continue to grow and really break these stigmas around conviction histories and criminal records. And constantly, if you are in a leadership position, ask, does this leave anyone behind? And if it does, how do we correct for that?
Yeah, I think I'd be remiss if I didn't mention the political aspect of this, and people not realizing how things are go together. Like in North Carolina, every single sheriff and DA is up to either get appointed again or they're going to get booted out. And so people understanding that and understanding what the DA's role is, where he falls or she falls at, and knowing, like, not just putting people there based on they may be in a party that you're in, but where do they stand on things that are important to you? Where do they stand on the barriers to reentry to people in our communities, and knowing we've seen areas that have progressive DAs do amazing things. You have amnesty days where people are able to get their driver's license back. In a poverty stricken area, that can make a major difference. If you're in an area where there's no transportation, if you're in an area where you don't have access to Uber or some of those things, just not having your driver's license can put you in a place of lack and need. And so I think that people need to also understand that. Another thing, in many cities and counties, there's city councils and county councils, they approve the police's budget, and they approve the budget for those detention centers that may be in their area. So I just want people, when you're making political choices, to make sure that you're choosing candidates that also believe in the world that you'd like to see.
I don't think there's too much to add to that. That was really powerfully articulated. I mean, the one thing Dreama didn't say that I will say is that if you have a bill fund in your county, you should donate to it, unless you happen to live in one of the few places in this country that has eliminated money bail. Most recently, Illinois, although they haven't enacted it yet. I think, thinking about ways to plug into organizing, even if you can't be sort of full-time engaged, can often be things like donating resources like money bail, but also we've seen so much mutual aid, for example, spring up in places. And I think I know many of the organizations we partner with see mutual aid and direct service work as really an integral part of their advocacy and base building. I think second chance hiring, as Kristen talked about. And then, I will say the American Rescue Plan Act, which was just passed and signed recently to respond to COVID-19, is going to inject billions of dollars into county budgets across the country. And one of the things that we see as a real opportunity to sort of underscore that budget justice piece is to try to have a seat at the table and say how that money is spent in your community. I think one of the incredibly powerful things about rural communities is just the social proximity. People have very close relationships to one another. There's a different level of accountability sometimes because you are going to see your sheriff maybe at the grocery store in a way that in New York City probably won't happen. And that can also make it really scary, I think, to challenge the existing power structures, to challenge people who are seen as the elites. But I think just taking advantage of social relationships. I will drop into the chat Vera's new-ish primer on budget justice advocacy specifically, because I think that's just a place to underscore how to plug in.
That's fantastic. Thank you so much. I'm taking notes over here frantically. All really good, really practical suggestions. It can be a 5-minute, Google search for us to figure out who our DA is, who's in office, that it would actually be a part of these things, whether we have a bail fund in our area, talk with our employers about what our hiring practices are, and even just really personally, kind of, I like that budgets are moral documents. Sorry, that just came in the chat. Yeah, all really, really practical. I appreciate that so much. What other kinds of questions are there out there? I have more if no one else has some.
I don't have a question per se, but I just am so grateful to be here to get connected with this. I am like very big on mental health awareness, just from my own personal journey with being hospitalized for about a year and being taken from, my place of privilege and in life, and being put into situations with all kinds of people, a lot of people that I now have such a heart for. But I guess I would love to hear about the Benevolent Farm, like how they do what I'm sure is like, mental health care, and how that works. I found myself at a what is the word for it? It was a 12-step kind of place that I went for recovery about 4 years ago, and yeah, they did not do a good job of dealing with caring for people's mental health. So I would just love it. It seems like I would love to live there. That seems like, just being able to walk in the woods and being in community, that's so huge. But I would love to hear anything else about mental health care.
Yeah, thank you for sharing your story too. I think mental health is the most infuriating part of my job, not from the people we deal with, but the systems that we confront. So, in terms of rural mental health care, interestingly, part of people's probation and supervision can be mental health care. There's one mental health care provider in Alamance that does not require insurance, and people have very strong opinions on that one place. We had one woman who refused to go there because that was where, before she was incarcerated, her child was taken from her at that location. And so there can be very difficult ways to access medication. Trauma-informed care is very difficult. So, at Benevolence, we operate on this trauma-informed harm reduction practice. So, by like you mentioned, the nature of the and outdoor area community, we ascribe to these permaculture principles that are really trying to just get at self-healing and self-care and community care. So, the women really guide it on their own. I mean, they talk about, like, when I weed, I think about all the problems I'm weeding out of the soil. They talk about how, like, one woman who was incarcerated for 27 years said coming to Benevolence was the first time she saw the open sky since her incarceration started. And that she would often talk about how she was on a heavy regimen of medication while in prison. And then upon getting released and coming to Benevolence, she, I think, just took some basic level anxiety medication and eventually just decided she wanted to do her herbal supplement type of thing, like, but all on her own, control and autonomy. So at Benevolence, we're kind of this, like, push and pull of offering people at least the environment and the community to heal and to offer this space that is outside of the carceral setting. And also that advocacy side coming in on the wraparound supports of, why does the sheriff need to be called out to our community every time someone has a mental health crisis? Like, we've had these direct interactions where the crisis intervention team came out, not really on our own will, and really made things worse. And then we've had healthcare providers mandate. We had one example of someone who they thought was experiencing suicidal ideation, and they said they would call the sheriff on her, a Black woman, if she did not report in 30 minutes to the one healthcare provider in the county. So, those are some of the intense challenges we faced, and the way we've kind of tried to get out around that is, unfortunately, going outside of our community in rural area to places like Eleanor Health, or some online responsive groups that do, like, even going to Harm Reduction Coalition for folks who have that intersection of substance use and mental health, because it's not present here. And that's really what I keep trying to say to people in Alamance County. I know Dreama and I have been on the same repeat over and over. And I even got, for my vacation, got hollered at it for calling it out, because it's just, I feel like, especially when I'm working on the bail fund stuff and people come out of the jail, and I say, I hear that you may not have a place to stay tonight, or I hear you may be mandated for mental health treatment. Like, how can we support you? And even, like, I think 2 weeks ago, I found out this week, a woman we bailed out 2 weeks ago had been violated on her conditions of release because she failed to seek mental health treatment. And when I had bailed her out, she said, well, how am I supposed to get there? I live 30 minutes away. I don't have a car. I don't have any way to go. And my family's not supportive of me getting treatment from there. So, and then they ended up violating her. And I think the one woman who really stands out too is, like, the judge, when for her, it was substance use. But I think this could apply to mental health. He said, well, you're lucky I'm not sending you to jail. I'm putting you on supervised probation. And that means, like, having to report in person to probation office. That means having to, go to all these different appointments. And she's like, well, I don't have a home. And so where are you are you going to give me a home? I don't have a car. So, sir, are you going to give me a car? And I don't have a phone. So how am I supposed to call my probation officer? Are you going to give me a phone? And so I think, she kind of just elevated this struggle we have of, like, the services just really aren't there. And if they are there, it's a challenge of trauma informed harm reduction care. So that's something where we really, for me, is a personal focus, especially this year and next year, I think. But I think in terms of what we can at least offer is, like, we have a place where people can rest and be safe. Like, we talk about how many nights of safe and secure housing, because people know at the end of the day, they're coming to Benevolence Farm, they're working outside, and they have full access. I mean, a lot of women will take a few days before they'll even go to, like, the barn, because they don't think they can, because they've just been told not to. And so we try to, again, use the therapeutic nature or therapeutic elements of nature for that. And we also have our therapy. We call it, they're not trained by any means, but our therapy animals of our dog Rosie and our chickens, who have many, many names. So, and I'll Dreama and Jasmine, if you have anything with mental health too.
Yeah, I mean, I'll just add, as a fellow veteran of our nation's just absolutely terrible behavioral health infrastructure and just awful inpatient treatment, I think, what we so often see is the way in which the movement toward deinstitutionalization in this country has just been sort of taken up by the criminal justice system, and instead people end up in jails. And I think the pattern connected to what Kristen is saying with this judge, right? is that in that shift between so many mental health beds coming offline and jails just being the, again, only place that many people had to go, particularly in rural counties, like I went to behavioral health care 3 hours away from where I grew up, and I had to get special money from the county and like go and beg for them to help me get treatment. And that experience, I was still lucky, right? So often what happens is you just get sent to jail. And then you have a judge who is not a behavioral health clinician, who has no training, who is deciding in so many cases what people have to do, where they have to go, what the appropriate amount of time that they spend, whether it's in, substance use specific housing or mental health specific housing. And there's often very little match to the actual needs that people have. And so some of what I think we have to continue to try to do is like wrest some of these decisions away from the criminal legal system and say, this is a public health issue. The idea that, a woman would go before a judge and a judge would say, as they very often do, like, you have to be on supervised probation and you have to go to this number of days of outpatient treatment with this place. They don't know what they're talking about, right? Like a judge is not a doctor. A judge cannot tell people what they need. And then when they do not comply with this arbitrarily sort of come up with condition, people are so often just sent back to jail and prison. And so again, I think bringing it back to both the budget justice piece and the like, know who you're voting for, some of it is just demanding different investments and demanding people do different things and saying we need to pull the criminal legal system and the behavioral health systems fully apart from one another.
The only thing I just want to share a story of someone in our community that was released from prison after a year or so, and stated that while they were there, they were able to get the medication, they took medication, and then they were released. And it's like, just, you figure it out. Mental illness medications are not medications you can stop and start very easily. They're usually just that they don't work that way. And sometimes stopping and starting them abruptly can create psychotic episodes of behavior. And so this particular person did not like the side effects of being off the medication and started using recreational drugs to self-medicate, which resulted in more charges and back in the system. And this particular person only needed to be able to continue that medication and therapy, and would have been able to have a productive life out in the community. And so I recently spoke with him, and he felt that it's just better for him to stay in jail and in prison. And I stated why, because at least they're giving him his medications he needs, And so I think about the resources of keeping him or so many others incarcerated, or so many other people, and think about how we possibly could use that same money in another way to help keep people from even entering that system.
Totally agree. And I think that it's hard for people to understand who have not experienced mental health issues themselves, how desperate of a space that can put you into. I know my sister's book, Helen Joy, who's here with us, she talked about, I hope it's okay I share this, you're usually pretty public about it, but how, she's like on the floor of her psychiatrist's office just begging for help. And she's like, if I had been bleeding out, they would have helped me, but you can't see what's going on the inside. And I think I could completely see it pushing someone to do whatever they could to just find relief, from that. Yeah. Any other questions? I didn't know, Kristen, if you wanted to share a little bit, and it may not be far enough along, I'm not sure, but the tiny home project, did you want to say anything about that?
Sure. So, at Benevolence, we hit our capacity, and we have a waiting list right now, which is kind of terrifying because it's so hard when people call to say we don't have any space for the rest of this year. So pretty bad feeling. And, you know, I think that we're trying to address that, and in part because actually our residents have asked for a second stage of living at Benevolence. It's not a new concept. It's been talked about for a few years, where you know, it's great to have this communal living area, but when people then are ready to move off, they feel like they're basically starting over another time from a better position, but like still finding all the furniture, having to live by themselves for the first time, and sometimes years or decades. And so the tiny home community is a 6-house neighborhood, so to speak, on the backside of our property, that the women have been integrally involved in designing what it looks like, how to use, because we were trying to comprehensively figure out how to use our 13 acres. So that is something we just launched fundraising for, as a way for women who are in the house, you know, they come there first in the communal living area, build up, meet some of their basic goals, and then eventually transition to those houses for the remainder of the 2-year stay that they have at Benevolence, where they can live independently. They have a separate exit and entrance, and allow them a little more autonomy, and to build up the infrastructure needs that they have to move. Because if you're moving from a house where most things are met, needs are met, it's kind of, even budgeting, they're like, I forgot to budget for toilet paper because y'all give it to us. And they're like, thank you. But like, they also need a transition. So we just launched our tiny home community fundraiser. We are hoping to, our plan is to build one for now, because we want to test it out and have the women live in it and give us feedback before we build all of them. But that's something we hope to at least break ground on early next year.
That's so exciting. Awesome. And is that fund on your website as well?
Yeah, so it should be in the housing and community resource section of our like program services section of the website. And if I can find it quickly too and put it in the link.
Awesome. Thank you. All right. So I guess those are all the questions that I have. Any other last thoughts or last questions from anyone?
I'd just say this has been excellent, you guys. Thank you so very much. It's, yeah, I just really appreciate this conversation and all the good work that you are doing for people who are coming out of prison, and all of us. So yes, thank you for raising the awareness and all the advocacy you're doing for so many people who really need it and deserve it. So I'm delighted that I was able to be here tonight.
And thank you for founding Benevolence Farm in the first place.
Yeah, absolutely, Tanya. It's humbling to be able to be on this with you too, and particularly after watching that, I'm like cracking up at the idea of therapy chickens. Having grown up with chickens, they kind of are like weird chicken TV. But thanks for being here.
I kind of feel like I just want to like walk outside and scream at the top of my lungs, like everyone needs to hear this. You know what I mean? It's like, there's so much to unpack here. You know, we could do 10 of these, each on a separate part of this, you know? So I hope that we can continue to stay in touch, and, you know, it's like sometimes just having these things, then you have it in the back of your mind and you can make those connections and kind of keep things moving along.
Yeah, and one of the things I wanted to share is so easy for people when they think of people within the system, people who have been charged with things, they think about really heinous things. But I mean, something as simple as not having a place to live and you're sleeping in an abandoned building, that's a trespassing charge. And so, you know, when we think of, like Kristen stated earlier, how easy it is for a person to find themselves on the registry. You know, I know people that took plea deals that resulted in them also going on the registry for other things. So it's just one of those things that you have to think. I never thought it would be me. We all think that it wouldn't be us, but a simple accident, a car accident that happens, a simple something that happens, because we're a country that criminalizes many things. And so as a result of that, it could happen to any one of us.
I totally agree with that. So prior to being the Radically Rural director, I was an accountant. And the first firm that I was with, I did tax representation. So as an enrolled agent, I was representing taxpayers before the IRS and state departments of revenue. And my perspective of tax offenders before that was so different. And then I realized like 90-something% of these people are just like your average person that didn't understand, made a mistake. The help is so hard to access if there is help. And it's like this, like you talk about, one thing happens and then it spirals and you can never catch up, and it's like, I really gained so much empathy with years of representation just for tax issues, and that's like the softball offenses kind of compared to some of the other things. So yeah. Helen Joy, were you going to say something? I saw you unmute.
I was just going to say, well, I've cried several times. I just remember in like the height of feeling so alone and not cared for, just wishing for a place to go to be cared for and to be seen as a human. And, you're talking about a world without prisons. Like, I want that so badly too. And I want to have my little my little mental health recovery place, in place of like a place that you can go as a human and receive care and help. I don't know. I'm just, it gives me chills and it makes me cry. And yeah, I'm just babbling.
Thanks for sharing that. And I can't help, but I did share her book in there. If anyone wants to read it, I'm a very proud sister. I keep copies around.
To that point real quick, I mean, that is when people question, like, what could a world without prisons look like? I mean, I think it's, what you just said, it's people going to communal spaces where they get the care that they need. And it could look a variety, dozens of different ways. And so, when people look at you and you're like, how are we going to even get to a world without prisons? I'm like, well, what would you need in this moment? It's probably not prison if you're in crisis. And think of all the things that would help you meet your basic needs. And that's what we need to build instead. So I think your point of, if you could go to a community farming location for mental health or substance use support, or, anything that's not a carceral system, could do our world a lot of good.
Yes.
And that just reminds me, Juliana, you asked earlier about what can people do. Have those imagining conversations. Like, let's imagine what public safety looks like in our community. Let's imagine what would it look like if all of our housing needs were met? What would it look like? Because these are the conversations that we're not having, we need to have, so that we can see and we can imagine and begin to think about the problems that have solutions and become solution oriented, even thinking about those things.
Absolutely. We have a lot of kind of like vision casting sessions here at Hannah Grimes because we're lucky enough to be working in a nonprofit that's a center for entrepreneurship. So, when we can set aside the time to dream, and we can't always take that time, but, it makes me think, I don't know, there has to be groups doing this, but are there any groups that are just getting together and dreaming and just talking about what it could be? Because I know sometimes you have to like bring it back down to earth a little bit, but sometimes if you don't do that, you don't get in that space of really reimagining, like Jasmine talked about. I want to be a part of, listening in on a group like that. And just like you said, just trying to reimagine what it could be. If there's not a group already, we could make one.
No, I mean, I think there are people doing this at the sort of community level, at the larger level all over the country. And I think it is always valuable to begin to catalyze that space with people who are close to you and think about, you know, who is it that you're in community with that you would reimagine with. I'm literally sitting next to this book, but I would recommend Miriam Kaba's book. I think one of the, you know, the first people from whom I ever had a real restorative justice lens and was pushed to think about what a world that was reparative would look like. I think most of what she has produced has catalyzed conversations at the local level, and Kristen has it in her backpack right now. I'm terrible at ordering books online, and I like routinely from Bookshop order multiple copies, so I have multiple copies of this one accidentally. But I would highly recommend it. And I think, you know, thinking about models like community pods, like who are you in a pod with, who are you accountable to, who are you in community with, just having some of those conversations.
While we're sharing books, I would like to share We Will Not Cancel Us. It talks about transformative justice, and that, like, let's not leave each other behind. And so that's my recommendation. And it's Adrienne Marie Brown. And she has other books about emergent strategy, who is moving to North Carolina, y'all.
I like how I had like in the chat, right as Jasmine was like, read this book. And then like seconds later, Dream was like, and this book. And the chat is now filled with our adoration for these two people. But they are really very, I think, transformative. And I think another two, just throwing out all the book recommendations, but Becoming Miss Burton by Susan Burton, who's formerly incarcerated woman herself. I give it to my interns. I give it to like any new staff person or as gifts to people. She runs a New Way of Life in LA. So she's doing kind of what we do in an urban setting and doing it much longer than we have. But she has this beautiful book, Becoming Miss Burton, that is just kind of about, again, the systems that led to her incarceration that really could have been avoided if we had the community and care investments, and how she turned it around to provide for other women too. So my final book recommendation.
I'm keeping track of these. I want to put like kind of a little summary when we post this on our website, you know, of resources and things like that. And of course, all of your websites and everything will have a lot of that, I'm sure, as well. Okay, so we are exactly 2 minutes away from 8:30, so we can go ahead and wrap up. I appreciate your time more than I can even say, and you can consider yourself having a lot more fans in your corner and supporting your organization, spreading the word, doing what we can in our own little corners of the world. So thank you again. It's really, really meaningful to have you as a part of this conversation. All right, everyone have a great night.
Bye,
Thank
friends.
you. Have a good night.
Bye.
Thank you.